Solving the mysteries of power. Can you feel the energy? Breaking the impossible.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Russian Nuclear Education Ambassadors podcast. If you are not here for the first time, we're glad to see you back. Today, we are going to discuss the potential careers a nuclear engineer can have after they finish their nuclear-related education. And in today's podcast, you are going to hear opinions and beliefs of two nuclear education students, popularizers of science. My name is Kaya. I am a nuclear engineering student from Czech Republic, studying nuclear power engineering and thermal physics in the Obninsk Institute for Nuclear Power Engineering. And I am also a popularizer of science who has been doing this for a couple of years and had the opportunity to work on a nuclear reactor. And today, my co-host / co-commentator will be Joshua. Joshua?
Thanks, Kaya. My name is Joshua Mwilima. I'm a Zambian student of nuclear physics and technology. I'm studying at the National Research Nuclear University, MEFI, in Moscow. And I'm also a popularizer of science. I'm also a Russian Nuclear Education Ambassador, working with Kaya. Nice one.
Thank you for the positive review. Okay, so speaking of the nuclear careers, obviously, studying nuclear engineering is difficult and it takes quite a while. So when a person actually nears the ending of the studies, sometimes they don't even start to realize that they should start thinking about their career and what they are actually going to do, because they're always thinking about kinetics and dynamics of nuclear reactors and their thesis and etc. But there are actually many options we can think of when we consider nuclear career and careers associated with nuclear engineering. Now, Joshua, you're studying second year of bachelor degree, which means you still have basically more than half of your study ahead.
Yeah.
So what comes to your mind when you start thinking about what could be a prospective career for a nuclear engineer who just finished their studies?
Okay, I think the first thing that comes to mind is working at the nuclear power plant as a nuclear engineer. Well, I've still got half of my study years to actually figure out exactly what career path I'm going to choose. But I think I'm a bit optimistic about being a nuclear engineer, especially working in a power plant. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can discuss a bit of what are the duties of a nuclear engineer in a nuclear power plant. What does that exactly look like?
Definitely, yeah. Well, the duty of an engineer in a nuclear power plant very much depends on what you are actually doing in a nuclear power plant. Nuclear power is a huge enterprise, basically. It's like a massive center where hundreds and hundreds of people of different specialities work. They work together and they care about basically a certain aspect of the day-to-day functioning of the power plant. Now, when we talk about nuclear engineering itself, the first thing that comes to mind in my personal view with regards to nuclear power plant would be an operator of nuclear reactor. Obviously, that got popularized by many TV series and shows.
Yeah.
The first one that actually comes to my mind is The Simpsons, which is probably not the first one that should come to my mind in terms of realism.
Which one is it?
The Simpsons.
The Simpsons.
Operator of a nuclear reactor. He worked in the nuclear power plant in Springfield, right? Remember? He was actually in the main control room.
I'm surprised to know that I actually haven't watched The Simpsons.
You have never watched The Simpsons? Okay,
No.
I believe we have a new topic for a podcast in the future, how that is possible.
Yeah.
But regardless, yes, he is actually working in the nuclear power plant. But in reality, when we talk about nuclear operators, getting a job as a nuclear reactor operator is quite difficult. First of all, you need to be in a country which actually has nuclear power plants or at least nuclear research reactors. We can talk about research reactors in a moment, but if we stick to the plants, first of all, the job is actually quite demanding and it involves a lot of regular working and it's quite monotonous. It's actually very similar to an airplane pilot, which our listeners may appreciate more in terms of comparison, because airplane pilots have quite monotonous jobs. they are doing things very similarly, but they have to always do it right. And even if everything like works properly, they often have to they always have to keep attention, because sometimes something might go wrong and they have to be there to fix it, right?
Yeah. And actually, you mentioned just now that to be a nuclear engineer working in a nuclear power plant, you have to be at least in a country that has a nuclear power plant. And that raises a question. You see, there's lots of nuclear physics students studying in different countries that come from countries that don't have nuclear power plants, you see. So I think it kind of raises the question, is it worth studying, or is it worth trying to build a career in nuclear engineering when you actually don't have a nuclear power plant in your home country? And I think I'm an example of that,
question.
You see. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Well, I'm in a country that has a nuclear power plant. We have two of them. They have Russian-based VVER reactors right now. So it's a bit more difficult for me to answer this question. But if I recall, you are from a country that does not have a nuclear power plant as of yet. Is that true?
That's
Where
true.
are you from, actually?
I'm from Zambia. So in Zambia, we do not have a nuclear power plant. We also don't have a research reactor. So prospects of a career in nuclear engineering, working in a nuclear power plant,
are quite
zero.
limited in Zambia.
Yeah. So
I'm a bit more optimistic than you are.
Yeah. So you can imagine what exactly is going on in my mind if I'm going to try and convince someone to study nuclear engineering if they're not going to work anywhere in my country. But you see, the world is a big place. You're not limited to your country. Except there's
Go on.
We're going to discuss this further along the way. But obviously, nuclear engineering, a nuclear engineer is not limited to working in a nuclear power plant. So there's many more opportunities and career.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to note here is definitely that even though a country doesn't have nuclear industry yet, doesn't mean it will not start to have nuclear industry. For example, I know that Rosatom has a large focus on Zambia and countries in this region in terms of development of nuclear power. So, for example, here comes another potential advantage if you are a specialist that is already educated in this field and your country decides to actually venture into the field of nuclear power and nuclear science. Suddenly, you are an extremely valued person that will have a very, very dramatic career growth in your own country, which, of course, you could consider to be a bit of a risk, because yes, it is. You don't know if that will happen or not, but if it does, it'll turn your life 180 degrees, basically, right? Even in your own country.
It's a potential risk, but everything is kind of a risk if you think about it. We never really know what the outcome is, basically.
Of course.
So
but if you go out on a street, there is a certain risk, and it's calculated that you will get hit by a car. It is a calculatable value, but we still walk out on the street and cross the road because we consider this risk to be acceptable, right?
Yeah.
It's really about what we consider like a good and healthy amount of risk. But at the end of the day, I certainly agree with you. Yes, nuclear power plants are really interesting, and if one is interested in them and has the opportunity to work in them and engage in their day-to-day work, that is something very interesting and certainly a good possibility to have a nuclear career at. But if a country is just starting on its nuclear journey, it's likely that they will first have a research reactor, which we talked about just before. And here's an interesting thing. Do you think research reactors are a bit more accessible to people who are studying nuclear engineering and are from countries which are still at the start of their nuclear journey?
Okay, so are they accessible?
Well, they're probably more accessible than nuclear power plants.
Definitely more accessible than power plants. But it depends on how far along the journey the country is in terms of adopting nuclear technology, or they're still just thinking about it. That certainly determines whether the research reactor is accessible in that country.
Definitely. And here we also see that, of course, especially with research reactors, it's much easier to partner up with a different nation, be that Russia or basically any other country that already has research reactors, because they are much more commonplace than nuclear power plants. Many countries that don't have nuclear power plants still have nuclear research reactors. So I guess there is a much easier space for international cooperation, especially because research reactor is also not as strategic resource as a nuclear power plant is, of course. So there is more science and less politics involved. That's how it is. But when we talk about this whole perspective of research reactors in newly developed nuclear industries, I heard that Zambia is like at the start of its nuclear industry, and that it's currently cooperating a lot with Russia. So do you have any idea how like currently Zambia's nuclear industry is progressing?
Well, what?
Because it's a good
Yeah,
case
it's a good
example,
key example.
right?
So what I can mention for a fact is that there was an agreement between the Zambian government and Rosatom in 2018 to build a center for science and research. So they're going to build a research reactor, basically. How far along the government has gone with this project, that is hard to say. Yeah,
Remains to be seen. But still, we can definitely agree here that research reactors certainly have the opportunity that they are more accessible, and also research reactors offer a lot different type of work than power plants do, and that's mainly because they are actually focused on research. So,
and in fact, I think
many people will actually have.
I think we can actually delve deep in that. Let's say, for a nuclear engineer who's not going to work in a nuclear power plant and is rather going to work in a research facility, like a research reactor, for example. General overview, what are some of the things that they will be doing? Let's say, on a day-to-day basis, what's a researcher
on a reactor?
Yeah, because like you said, in the power plant, the job is kind of autonomous. You see, you're going to monitor what's happening, making sure you're attentive that nothing goes wrong, and the process is running automatically.
And you're sort of making very precise changes and things like that, yes. And they're very well pre-planned.
Exactly. But a nuclear engineer, the research reactor, is kind of not doing some autonomous job. They're actually working on some research. But what kind of research do they do there, for example?
Yeah, I worked on a nuclear reactor and for some years, and I was actually a researcher. And what you do on day-to-day basis is actually often related to nuclear power plants, but maybe from a bit different perspective than many would think. The first thing that you do quite often is testing of materials and their properties that are important with regard to nuclear reactor. So, for example, suppose we want to have a new neutron absorber, which is a material that is used in control rods to decrease power of a nuclear reactor. Well, before we put it in a nuclear power plant, we have to test it out in some controlled environment. We will have some mathematical and physical models that tell us, okay, this should work. And now we need to put it in practice. So we're going to take one piece of this new material, and we are going to put it in a research reactor and do a controlled experiment where we will be able to measure how exactly this piece performs and whether it performs according to expectations or not. And based on that, we can, for example, determine whether such piece is indeed as good of an absorber as we thought, and whether we should, for example, make control rods for nuclear power plants out from it. That would be one example.
That leans a lot more towards research into nuclear power plant related technology. But there's also a gap. Well, we're talking about nuclear engineering. So there's usually this divide where physicists and engineers think they're two different kinds of people. So now a nuclear engineer is a kind of interesting bridge between the two, because the physicist is kind of more like a researcher than the engineer. But what can we say about a nuclear engineer who's more physics oriented? Do you think they've got an opportunity to like work on cutting edge research in physics when they're in a nuclear nuclear technology environment, like a research reactor?
Of course. And in fact, I kind of suggested that in my previous answer, because remember when I said that if you are, for example, testing some new material, that material already has models and physical models that tell that this material should work. And this is what the physicist actually does. The physicist looks at the theory and chooses, okay, this is how it should work. Let's put it into practice. And then he gives it to the engineer, and the engineer says, yes, this works, or no, it doesn't work for some reason. And the physicist and engineer typically cooperate in very close cooperation, really. They work very much together. That's at least my personal experience.
Okay. And you're studying to be a physicist or engineer? Which one is it?
That's a good question, because I am studying nuclear power engineering and thermal physics. So I'm actually studying both.
So that means you can...
I will have a very, very large scope of options when I finish my studying, because I can go both on the theoretical path and on the more practical one. But there is one more very practical thing that's done on nuclear reactors, and that's a thing we haven't covered yet. That is creation of radiopharmaceuticals. Suppose we have some solid material and we want to make it, for example, radioactive, to use it as a contrast substance, or we need to create a different isotope by irradiating it with certain radiation source. We can do that on a nuclear reactor or with a dedicated source of that type of radiation. And by doing this, we will actually create a substance we need to, for example, perform a scintigraphy, right? Which is basically a diagnostic method that we use to find out whether, for example, a person has an embolism or things like that. So work on nuclear reactors and sources of radiation often actually involves preparation of substances that can be used as various diagnostics for various diagnostics, such as contrast substances, but also radiopharmaceuticals, for example, for cancer treatment. These are indeed radioactive substances that are used to basically kill out the cancerous cells by radiation. So these substances are often also created by radiation sources. Sometimes they're created directly by a research reactor, and sometimes they are created by a dedicated source of neutrons.
Yeah. Actually, you just highlighted another special field that's included in our theme, nuclear medicine.
Exactly, yes.
But you mentioned it in line with nuclear reactors in nuclear power plants.
Well, not necessarily power plants. You're probably not going to make radiopharmaceuticals in an NTP, but with research reactors, yes, definitely.
So that means you're working at a hospital, is it?
Well, if you are preparing them, sometimes they are prepared in a hospital, sometimes they are prepared in dedicated centers, such as when they are created by a reactor. Not every hospital has a nuclear reactor, that's quite a rare thing. I believe they may be some, actually. I heard there may exist. But if it's created by a neutron source, yes, it can be done in a hospital. But of course, the usage of these substances is then typically within hospitals' premises, right? You typically inject them or have people breathe or drink them. And yes, that is typically done where the actual medical observation is being carried out.
I guess what you just mentioned highlights the fact that nuclear engineering isn't limited to working in a power plant or a research reactor. It basically intersects with different other spheres.
Yeah, it's a very multidisciplinary environment. You can basically choose whichever field of industry you can go. For example, just a quick note, radiation is, for example, used to sterilize fruits and vegetables.
Exactly what I was going.
Like, that is something people don't often think about, ionizing radiation, but yes, it is involved. It makes our apples safe.
And last longer.
And last longer. And it might sound like it is quite funny when we say it in this context. I'm not gonna lie, I am smiling here as well, but it's true that it's very important and extremely important, especially from the economical standpoint, because these apples then last much longer. And then we can afford, I don't know, in Russia or in Europe to have, I don't know, some tropical fruits like coconuts, or I don't know if coconuts are actually treated with radiation, but cacti are. So, for example, if I want to eat some cacti, which are amazing, by the way,
I haven't tried them.
Then you should. They are very good and very healthy, but they are not growing in Russia or Europe, for that matter, obviously. So they are typically delivered by a plane or by a ship. And especially if they are traveling by a ship, the fact that they are treated by radiation can extend their life and their basically best before time by a long time. So they become much more economical and therefore cheaper for people to buy. So these things are very actually interesting and important when we actually think about them seriously.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've all now discussed quite a few topics and ways nuclear science can be done and how a person can be involved in nuclear science. And we sort of didn't cover what we are doing right now, and that is popularization of these things, right? Because popularization of science is something that actually is close to both of our hearts. We are quite involved in it. We are popularizers of science. So for us, I guess we can both say that we are a bit biased in this sense, which is fair. Always note your bias, right? As they say in the scientific sphere. But at the end of the day, popularization of science is really important because it makes people understand that, yes, science is of course important, but also science can be not scary, and science can be something that we can learn about, understand in simple words, and not be afraid of, right? So
we need science. We've evolved to apply science in our daily lives, especially in this 21st century. So it's kind of a requirement that everyone is on the same track when it comes to at least understanding the bare minimum of what's going on in the scientific field.
Of course. Yeah, because, when we talk about science and stuff, for people uninitiated to it, people can be often quite easily scared by new scientific discoveries, and that, we can actually talk about particle physics here a little bit because, fusion, one of the methods for nuclear fusion is the ignition method, where you basically take a bunch of lasers, shoot them at one point, a little ball of hydrogen, and basically make them fuse into helium. And that is basically creating a microscopic sun inside a building. And when you say it that way, it's incredibly cool. But for people who don't know what it means, it can be quite scary. If I exaggerate this, some people could be afraid that, I don't know, we create a sun on our planet, right?
Yeah.
And if we don't explain them, no, that's not how these things work. It is perfectly safe, and we are taking many, many precautions, and we know that this cannot happen. People will obviously not know. So we need to make sure that they know.
Exactly.
So when we think about nuclear science in general, I think the most important part is we need to consider what is the goal of the popularization, right? And when we talk about popularization of nuclear science, it typically means that we need to show that, yes, nuclear science is really cool, but also nuclear science is safe, and it's not something we should be afraid of. Because, Nuclear accidents are scary, especially in the case of nuclear power plants. Yes, there is no question about it. They are scary.
Actually,
and that's why we should learn from them and educate about
exactly.
them.
Unfortunately, nuclear science, especially the word nuclear, has created a bad name for itself. Accidents happen; they're scary, and we learn from them. And people should know that we're far much better than they think we are in terms of avoiding these accidents. So popularizing science, nuclear science for that matter, is going to be very important in that prospect.
It is, and it's certainly here to stay because, currently we have era of nuclear renaissance. More and more nuclear power plants and reactors are being built all over the world. And that means more and more people are being exposed to nuclear science. And there are more things related to it, such as, deep storage facilities for, depleted nuclear fuel. And these things, they raise questions. And if we are to make sure that the general audience understands that these things are not particularly dangerous, that if we take correct precautions, they are nothing we should be afraid of, then everything will be fine. We can take a simple example with, for example, a water reservoir. Yes, if a dam in a water reservoir breaks, the results will be quite bad, and there are some historic examples. Exactly. It is certainly a big problem, and we need to prevent it, and we need to take many, many precautions to make sure it cannot happen, or that the chance of it happening is as low as reasonably possible. And the same thing is really with nuclear power. Yes, it is possible that there might be a nuclear accident, but due to the way how science works, that chance is lower every day because more and more steps are taken to make sure nuclear power and nuclear industry is safer and safer for everyone around it.
Exactly. Which actually, this just reminded me of a question that usually pops up when popularizing nuclear science to the general public, especially related to nuclear energy. I know I'm diverting a little bit away from our careers in nuclear science theme.
That's okay.
But there's usually a concern from the general public about adopting nuclear energy when we're actually thinking about sustainable development and green energy, and when we're talking about renewable energy. People like to compare nuclear energy and renewable energy. Is it worth making nuclear power plants if we can just go the renewable way, make dams and make solar farms and wind farms? Those kind of questions usually come up in nuclear science, nuclear energy popularization.
Indeed, and these are really still about the career. It's not like we are actually off topic like you suggested. These things are really important for a popularizer of nuclear science to cover. Like, when we talk about this, like, of course, when I think about it from my perspective, I really do not have anything against sustainable resources, other sustainable resources such as wind, water, solar power. And there are countries where that is enough. Some countries like that, maybe for example Austria, which has a lot of mountains, so there are many rapid rivers, there is relatively high amount of sunshine, and there is also a lot of wind because it's alpine mountains, it's alpine environment. So that country can exist without nuclear power and can have a very sustainable energy mix. But unfortunately, that is simply not possible in many of the countries in the world. And that's where nuclear power comes in, because it is very sustainable. And even if we say, okay, nuclear fuel is technically not a renewable resource, although it sort of is by breeding it. But even if we didn't, suppose we say that, comparing it to something like coal or gas is just completely different.
It's very different, because obviously it's greener if we're going to compare it to gas and coal. And if we're also going to talk about the energy, the amount of energy we get is definitely different. It's a better option, basically.
Certainly. And I believe we really gave our listeners a pretty good information about this part, because yes, there are certainly many options for careers that people can study after they finish their nuclear related education, and that's really has been our goal,
Exactly.
hasn't it?
In fact, that's the main aim of today's podcast. We're basically outlining different career prospects in our field, nuclear science. What you could end up doing, or what your career might look like in prospect in the near future once you graduate in this field of study.
Certainly, like it's easy to see that there's so many options, from power plant working to research to nuclear medicine. The options are really endless, and it should be noted that what we said here is just probably a part of that story. There's a lot more options to like study stuff. For example, if you want to irradiate cacti, you can have that as your career choice, certainly. But anyway,
Certainly.
I think this is really a wrap for our podcast. So thank you so much to our amazing audience for listening to us today. We hope you learned something and hopefully enjoyed it. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and we, Kaya and Joshua, are going to look forward to meeting with you next time on the Russian Nuclear Education Ambassadors podcast.
Well, thanks, Kaya. And once again, see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.
RNEA, unraveling the mysteries of power. Can you feel the energy breaking the impossible? RNEA, unraveling the mysteries of power. Can you feel the energy